So now we want to go kind of crazy, and we're going deep into the details of things that you can do in here, and this can get very, very confusing and very kind of hard to follow sometimes, but it's a really important concept to start paying attention to, which is this idea of keyframing, which allows you to change parameters on your clip over time. So rather than cutting up a bunch of clips and making one like go at 25% speed and the other one go at 50% speed and the other one go to 100, you can kind of actually like alter those things all in the same clip. So I'm going to show you the basics of how to do a keyframing, and we'll just start with something really simple like opacity. So a good example of this would be if I took this piece of footage here and I decided I wanted to overlay it over the top of this other piece of footage, but I kind of wanted it to fade in opacity, right? So I wanted the opacity to change, but I didn't want to just go like, I mean, I wanted it to go from like 0% up to, 50%, and then, back down to 0%. I could do that in a couple different ways with like crossfades or something, but really the best way to do it is to learn how to keyframe opacity. So in all the Adobe products, you're going to see anything that's capable of being keyframed, you're going to see this little stopwatch kind of icon next to this thing, right? And so again, if I just click that stopwatch, I'll see a little diamond appear over here in this sort of really small little representation of my timeline, right? And right now I've got my opacity down to 0%. So that means that this clip is set to be 0 all the way through. But the keyframe says, okay, at this point in time, at the very beginning of the clip, it's at 0. So if I pulled this clip forward and then I cranked this opacity up to say, let's go up to like, 40%, let's say. Now the timeline or the computer's basically interpreting for me the difference between these. And so now if I push play, you'll see that it goes from 0% all the way up to 40% here, where it stays, right? And then as I scroll along, let's say I wanted it to stay at 40% for a while and then go back down to 0. Well, I could kind of zoom back out here. Sorry, zooming in on accident. There you go. I can drop another keyframe by hitting this little button here that says add or remove keyframe. So I can click there. So that means it's going to stay at 40% it's going to go from 0 to 40% in this time, right, on the timeline. And then it's going to stay at 40% here, and then it's going to go down to 0 if I crank this back to 0 here. So it's adding another keyframe in there. So now if I click and watch this whole thing through, I've got this kind of fade between, okay, it's going to get stronger, more overlay, 40%. It's going to hold at 40% for a few seconds, and then it's going to go down to 0 when it hits the next keyframe. And so the cool thing about that is if I wanted to, I can adjust this by just clicking on these keyframes now and dragging them back and forth. And what that'll do is that will adjust when these changes happen, right? And so now the keyframe will be like, okay, it's going to adjust a little bit differently. So I can go in, I can zoom, I can really micro adjust these, right? So that's the basics of like keyframing, and really all the basis of all animation in these programs is going to be built on this. So it's important to kind of get the hang of it. And so I would suggest starting off and playing around with opacity. It's the easiest one, but you'll notice all of these pieces have they have keyframing in them, right? So if I wanted to, I could keyframe scale. So I can do the same thing where I click the stopwatch here and I added a scale thing. It's at 100 for 50%. Now, if I wanted it to be almost like a fake zoom, I could scale this up now, right? So it's almost like this is zooming in as it goes through. So now if I push play, I'm going to go from 150%, and then it's going to kind of like zoom in, almost like the camera's like zooming in even faster, right? And so, it's a lot of different ways to play around with this. You'll notice if I have a keyframe someplace and I don't like it, like I don't want to use it, I can just double click, or I can click on it and delete it, and it'll get rid of the keyframe, and I can uncheck the stopwatch. That'll delete all the keyframes, and it'll go back to nothing, 0, right? Another thing people like to do sometimes is kind of like a fake pan, where you can keyframe like your position, right? So if I click my button, here, and I add a keyframe there, and then I go to a little bit further down, and then I change the the parameter of the XY position, right? Now it's gonna move that whole piece of footage like along, kind of almost like you know, you can see how it's gonna scoot it as it goes by. So if you have a static image that you want to like look like you're panning over, this is like you blow it up really close and then you pan over it using the X and Y position changes. So that can be something that could be quite useful too. So again, if I don't like what I did, I can just click through and get rid of them and uncheck that box, the stopwatch. So again, that's the basic stuff that's found in the effects controls. But if let's say I add an actual effect. So let's say I'm going through here and I'll just undo all of these. So I'll just take this off and I'll go ahead and delete the keyframes. So make sure you know what you're doing there. I'll crank that one back up to 100. Let's say I wanted to add an effect where I like change the color here. I could go to color correction, click on that, and I could go to, let's just try this one for fun. We'll drop it on the clip. Right, so then you see that shows up here in our, like in our kind of list of effects that are happening on there. And then if I click to in there, I will see eventually, I'll see, oh good Lord, there's a lot of stopwatches. So you can really go crazy, right? So if I click this stopwatch, it's gonna put a keyframe there, and if I scroll forward and then I crank this thing up like that, now I'm going to transition that effect is going to hit here, and as soon as it hits that, it's going to start cranking up the change of color that I told it to do over that amount of time. So you can keyframe effects, you can keyframe movements, you can keyframe almost everything. So it's a good thing to remember, like always twirl down into the menus until you find the stopwatch to kind of like look at the thing you actually want to kind of try and keyframe, right? It can be really complicated, like I said, and really confusing if you're not used to it, or it just gets really easy to get lost. So, but it's all in there, and Adobe lets you kind of control almost any variable that you want to over time using keyframes.